In today's video, I'm going to be giving you 5 top tips for how to capture better images of wildlife. To do that, rather than showing you photos from far-flung, exotic and expensive locations where realistically only a small percentage of people can actually afford to visit, for the rest of this tutorial I'm only going to be illustrating my points with images of either familiar species like this badger, common species like this coot, or easily accessible subjects like these gannets which live in vast colonies on many parts of the UK mainland. It is these kinds of species and many others like them that have been the cornerstone of my entire professional career, and I have built that career around the work that I've been able to do with them. This is why I want to share some of my top tips with you. After all, if I can do it, then so can you. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. My name is Andy Parkinson. I'm a National Geographic photographer, a Nikon Europe ambassador, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to take better images of wildlife. Subscribing is always free, so please do consider it as a great way to support my content. Stay until the end of this video and I'm going to share with you my top tip to make your images look their authentic best. And a common mistake to avoid, a mistake that I see so many other photographers and even fellow professionals making. My first piece of advice then is to do what I have always strived to do, and that is to take extraordinary images of ordinary subjects, and that is a lot easier than it sounds. When I was first starting out in photography, I couldn't afford to travel. Not only could I not afford to travel abroad, I couldn't even afford to travel around the UK. So I pretty much drew a 10-mile radius around my Derbyshire home, and I set about exploring every hedgerow, every river, lake, forest, field and canal within that area. Now, one advantage I have is I'm lucky to live in a very beautiful part of the country, one that is rich with wildlife. But wherever you live in the world, I would encourage you to explore your local area first. There are so many advantages to this way of working. Firstly, it'll be more affordable as you'll be spending less money travelling. You'll also be more responsive when the weather changes, and you'll be able to get out quickly if the weather is suddenly favourable, like I did with this great crested grebe image. It'll also be less of a negative if you head out and maybe the weather wasn't what you were hoping for, which, let's face it, happens all the time. This is what occurred when I happened upon this bathing grey-lag goose, which is why I ended up choosing to explore a slow exposure technique as the weather was so dull and drab. She was kind enough to carry on bathing for a while, the repetitive behaviour giving me the opportunity to experiment with different shutter speeds. Massively important as well is that you're guaranteed to be producing completely unique and therefore credible bodies of work. There's nothing wrong with going to paid sites or established hides, as they can be really useful for those with less time, maybe full-time jobs. But you just need to bear in mind that hundreds, maybe even thousands of photographers will have been there before, sitting in the same seat, photographing the same animal in the same setting. So likely, you'll only be producing a version of what magazine editors and competition judges, even a social media audience, have seen countless times before, and you'll likely be paying about $150 to $300 per day for the privilege. If you work with familiar common subjects, then you'll also be giving a voice to and revealing the beauty and the value of these often overlooked species. Species that others often don't bother with, likely because they are too common or too familiar. So instead of seeing these as negatives, see the benefit, the potential of both of these qualities, because with these come an ease of accessibility and a level of certainty about finding them, which, let's face it, is pretty much the first rule in wildlife photography. This is why I've worked with swans for so many years. In addition, you'll also get to spend so much more time photographing, practicing, learning about your equipment, your settings, what works and when, and what doesn't and why. That way, when a certain aspect of behaviour does occur, you'll be more likely to know what autofocus settings or what exposure technique will give you the most reliable result. As a result, The quality of your images will also improve as you'll learn more about the fall of light, how the sun's arc transitions through the sky, and how the resulting light changes every minute of every day, and the new opportunities that this presents for you to explore photographically. In this way, you'll likely get more creative, you'll experience more, so fresh ideas will take root, they'll germinate, giving you the opportunity to try new things, and who knows where that might take you. You'll naturally begin to develop your own distinctive eye, your style, what appeals to you uniquely and why. You must cherish this no matter what. Remember to always take images only for you, that you like, that you connect with. This is when you will really start to flourish photographically, and hopefully you'll produce some images that you're really proud of. Most importantly about this way of working is that you'll also learn an enormous amount about the subject's behaviours, about the subtle nuances, the little clues in their body language, their posture that indicates what is about to happen, so you can anticipate rather than react. Anticipating behaviour will always be quicker, more effective, more productive than simply reacting when you might miss it altogether, or you'll be forever playing catch the coot as it's running out of the right hand side of the frame. And as you learn more about their behaviour, so this brings me to my next point, and that is to learn when to photograph certain species. This is a vital consideration in the quest to produce the very best images that you possibly can, as unique photographic opportunities present themselves at different times of the year, depending on the species. Late summer, as an example, has great potential for badgers in the UK, as the long summer evenings means that you'll have more chance of photographing them just before dusk, a time that the French poetically refer to as the hour between dog and wolf. It is this special time that I have always sought out in my work with badgers. Though looking at the EXIF data on this image, I'm glad that modern incarnations of cameras now have much higher ISO capability. I was very, very lucky to get this image sharp at a painfully slow shutter speed of just 1/13 of a second. But as I was already stretching the ISO tolerance of this DSLR camera, I just didn't feel that I had any latitude to increase it. In contrast, however, late summer I feel is a lousy time to try and work with mute swans, though I must point out that these next two images were taken earlier in the year, when the adults still look presentable and the cygnets yet to reach their ugly duckling phase. Just 2 months later, the adults will have lost their primary feathers, so not only can they not fly, but their plumage also looks very ragged and unkempt. Now, as uncompromising as it might sound, and I know it does, this will negatively affect the resulting images, not to mention massively reducing the chance of particular behaviours, like takeoff or landing, obviously because they can't fly, being displayed. There also isn't really much going on with them behaviourally at this time of year, because as their cygnets have grown bigger, so they're less vulnerable, the adults much less territorial or ferociously protective, so the family just typically spend their days lazily gliding around the lake with a load of ugly ducklings trailing behind them. By aiming to photograph certain species at specific times of the year, you'll also have the best chance of capturing interesting aspects of explosive behaviour, which typically occur or peak at these very specific times of the year. If you live in the UK or many parts of Europe, then trying to capture boxing brown hares likely represents one of the biggest photographic challenges that I can think of. And believe me when I say this, it isn't much easier with mountain hares either. The breeding season is often one of the key times to seek out photographically, as both birds and mammals will look their very best. This is when you'll typically see beautiful courtship rituals from birds like grebes or gannets. Here, I framed these courting gannets against the shadowed backdrop of distant cliffs. By exposing for the bright sunlit gannets, the shadowed backdrop has fallen into dramatic underexposure. It is this dark background that has revealed the subtle translucence of their interlocking bills. Contrast the look and feel of that gannet image with this one of a pair of courting great crested grebes, where I exposed specifically for the misty backdrop to protect both the colour and the detail. It is this conscious decision to prioritise the mist in the image with the correspondingly fast exposure that has forced the grebes to be underexposed and to fall into silhouette. Another species that I routinely try for every year is foxes and their cubs, which typically start appearing outside their natal dens around late May, early June. These were the youngest I've ever been privileged to photograph, but foxes, and more specifically their cubs, do represent an accessible though challenging local species. I find that it's also the best time of year for me to capture images, or to try to capture images of the elusive adults, as they will occasionally appear back at the den site. These visits are typically brief though, as the adults always seem to be persistently exasperated with the needy cubs. Though I will detail the game-changing effects of the Nikon Z9 in a future tutorial, it is images like these of the adult captured using the silent shutter that is a perfect example of just one of the many reasons why improvements in camera and lens technology can have real-world benefits for photographers who simply want to remain an unseen, unnoticed observer, silently documenting the natural behaviour that unfolds before them. Sometimes, however, when it comes to seeking out certain species at specific times of the year, I do so for one reason, and that now brings me on to my third strategy for taking better images. And that is to seek out, or at least to embrace, challenging conditions, but with one very important caveat, and that is to please do it safely. Now, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that you go and sit on top of a perilously high 150 metre cliff in a force 8 gale like I did for this gannet image, but rather I want you to realise just how much certain weather conditions can add detail, context, interest and value to an image. This gannet image looks more like a painting, intentionally so, as I've increased the depth of field to try and create front to back sharpness. From the closest gannet to the crashing waves below, the image is filled with interest and detail, and this is why I've been happy to leave it on screen for so long. So whether it is wind, rain or snow, each one brings its own merits, and each one brings unique challenges. Working with the mountain hares, I have always prioritised the depths of winter, not only for the stark, unrelenting beauty of a snow-covered landscape, but also for the potential ferocity of the conditions, or when, at least, I felt that we had the best chance of perfect conditions. For me, that is a fresh fall of snow, high winds and freezing temperatures, because that is when the Scottish mountains get really interesting. These conditions also give you the creative freedom to experiment, to maybe play around a little bit with shutter speeds, to either freeze the motion of the snow completely or to introduce a little bit of movement. This again will always come down to the uniqueness of the opportunity and to your own personal tastes. Mine vary depending on many different factors, but in this moment I tended to favour shooting at a slightly slower shutter speed, revealing the motion of the swirling spindrift. As you can see from this video clip, the conditions that day were far from ferocious, and whilst it was bitingly cold, I still wanted the images that I produced to convey something of the feeling of calm, the feeling of tranquility that I was experiencing, silently sitting and shivering next to this wonderfully stoic hare that we had named Grouse. Some of the later images, captured with a faster shutter speed, also lent themselves effectively to being made into black and white, the rich blue backdrop of the shadowed ice field dark enough to reveal the swirling snow. Arguably the most transformative conditions in which I've ever found myself was whilst photographing this red deer stag. 20 minutes before this image was taken, there was no snow, none on the ground, the trees or the deer. Such was the ferocity of this Scottish winter squall that the entire scene was transformed in minutes from abject mediocrity to this winter wonderland. And this image perfectly represents one of the great benefits about working in challenging conditions, and that is the added narrative that it can offer to your images. Take this gannet image for example. At closer inspection, is it fundamentally flawed, let down by the poor quality of light, or is it, as I believe, rescued by the unfolding drama of the scene? The dramatic towering waves serving to contextualise the often perilous lives of the gannets, the bird itself emerging, phoenix-like, from the vastness of the maelstrom behind. And yet it is in these conditions, with these high winds and tempestuous seas, that the gannets really come alive. I've been privileged to witness the first and final leap to freedom and adulthood of countless adolescent gannets, and it is always on these days that they take that irreversibly heroic leap to their immediate independence. In contrast to the drama of the previous two gannet images, this relatively mundane image of an adult in flight is elevated marginally by the falling rain that surrounds it. The rain only visible as I framed the gannet against the shadowed backdrop of distant cliffs. When it comes to rain in particular, it's not that I'm suggesting that you necessarily seek it out, but rather don't simply retreat as soon as it appears. Consider instead the possibilities that will arise, like with this puffin image, bejeweled by raindrops, streaks of rain created by a relatively slow shutter speed. Remove the added elemental interest of the rain and, being brutally honest as always, only a mediocre puffin image would remain. The best way to avoid mediocrity is to diligently follow my fourth and penultimate piece of advice, and that is to get out early and stay out late. Now this might seem like blindingly obvious advice, but I am relentlessly surprised at how many people fail to follow this through, even fellow professionals. When I go out early, like I did when I photographed these mallard ducklings, or the shaking great crested grebe, I typically only stay out for a maximum of maybe 1 to 2 hours. That's because once I've experienced the exquisite first light of dawn, it renders pointless the idea of working in the much poorer quality of light that follows, the ephemeral mist of a tranquil dawn and all of its elemental beauty long since burnt away. Indeed, there is often merit to arriving on location even earlier, not only to add to your growing database of learned observation, but also to benefit from the cool blue hues of pre-dawn light. Of course, there are some subjects that can tolerate a more persistent, lengthier approach that stretches into the realm of lower quality light. But you have to get the basics right first, and that means being there for first light. It is this knowledge, and this knowledge alone, that I use as my motivation when I'm trying to drag myself out of my warm bed at 3 a.m. Remember the wildlife photographer's mantra, and that is, the harder I work, the luckier I get. Fight back against the lame excuses that your mind will conjure. The weather doesn't look quite right, I'll definitely go tomorrow, I'm not convinced by what I might see. I know every excuse because I've made every excuse, and I want you to avoid making the same error. Much like the regrettable pain of leaving an evening location too early, convinced perhaps that the sun's disappearance behind a cloud has signalled the end of the photographic opportunities. There's a very good chance that it hasn't. Time and again, I've looked back at the badger wood that I've just left, only to see the sun impossibly break through a small crack in the clouds, my mind immediately tortured by the thought of what I might be missing. perhaps even a badger having a belly scratch in glorious late evening light. Believe me, I experienced FOMO long before FOMO was even a thing. At other times at my lake site, I've been packing my gear into the car, only for the setting sun to once again make an unscheduled reappearance. Meanwhile, the moorhen that had sat idly by for hours as I waited diligently suddenly leaps into action, sprinting across the lake directly in front of where I was sitting minutes before and still should have been. It hurts, believe me, don't do it. Wait until the sun has definitely set, even if that does mean scrolling on your phone. Do whatever it takes, but please stay. Sometimes you might even end up trapped by the very subject that you're there to photograph, as I have been many times by fox cubs, unable to leave my camouflage hide by their continued presence within sight of where I sit concealed. In those moments, maybe it is worth setting yourself free photographically in the diminishing light. Time, perhaps, to try something different? After all, once the exquisite light has faded, any portrait captured will always pale into insignificance in comparison with those captured in the late light that you waited so patiently for. My last piece of advice for today is, again, through the painful process of learning by my own mistakes, and that is to keep an open mind, especially when you're thinking about the perspective or even the distance from where you shoot. I'm almost embarrassed to say how many years I wasted at this site, taking nothing more than one-dimensional headshots of badgers from as close as I could possibly get. To be fair, this was very much in the earliest days of my career, when getting any shot of a badger, especially in daylight, was a reasonable achievement. Nevertheless, in hindsight, I do wish that I'd been more creative, more imaginative and more observant, especially as I've now lost this wonderful sight to a sad and depraved, dim-witted landowner that likes to shoot whatever he can stumble upon. To this day, I still can't understand why I didn't step back a bit to look at the bigger picture, the wider scene. Why I didn't shoot to include a little bit more habitat, because if I had, then I would have been taking images like this instead. Images that say so much more about the subject, that show the relationship between the animal and its home, not to mention the insane quality of light that occur here in the last few seconds before sunset, this hilltop location receiving the very last remnants of light from the setting sun. I also want you to avoid becoming too overly blinkered by shooting from one particular perspective, as I mistakenly did when I first discovered my awesome water level sight. This is where the overwhelming majority of my water level bird images have been captured. Here you can see my setup as I shoot comfortably from a chair, my camera and lens mounted on a tripod, but my perspective is exactly at water level. This does create some fantastically intimate opportunities, but for too long I was too single-minded, too blinkered, too determined to only shoot this way. Instead of ever occasionally visiting the other end of the lake, where I could have shot the morning mist in backlight, I opted against, simply because I couldn't find a workable water level perspective. This was an egregious error and one that I won't make again. It is worth pointing out as well that whilst I've spent many months capturing beautifully lit water level portraits of mute swan cygnets, none have ever been awarded, either nationally or internationally. Rightly so, I hasten to add, because even though they are beautifully lit, there isn't enough additional elemental quality to the images to make them worthwhile of any accolades. Images of the same cygnets, however, taken from a higher, almost vertical perspective, have done much better, winning categories in prestigious international competitions like Nature's Best and Nature Photographer of the Year. And this brings me finally to the top tip that I promised you at the beginning of this video. Now, I know a lot of you are at home watching this now will be keen photographers, and as such, a lot of you will have your white balance of your camera set to auto white balance. And this maybe you'll justify by saying, well, I can easily correct it or adjust it in post-processing. No. One of the greatest beauties of wildlife photography is that anybody with any equipment, if they happen to be in the right place at the right time, can take an absolutely astonishing image, a globally significant image that you might want to potentially enter into a competition. But let me give you a little challenge. I want you to go outside and take an image of whatever you want on auto white balance. Then I want you to change the white balance on your camera to the Kelvin scale, to K, and I want you to set it to 5560. Now I want you to take exactly the same image that you took moments before on auto white balance. I also want you to take just one more image, but this time at 5880 Kelvin. Now when you review those three images in sequence, which one looks the most authentic? Which one looks the most accurate? Sunny or overcast, it does not matter. I shoot 95% of the time in and around 5560 Kelvin because for me, authenticity of the final image is absolutely key. Now occasionally, when I'm shooting either in the shade or when the sun has set, I might warm it up a little bit more, maybe just go over 6000 Kelvin, but that's it. So that's your homework. Let me know in the comments below what you thought, and if you like this video, then please do consider giving it a thumbs up. And remember that subscribing is always free and it's the very best way to support my content. So thanks again so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.